Hello and welcome to our webinar, snappily titled Getting Better at Evidencing the Full Range of Young People's Dispositions. This event is hosted by the Edge Foundation. It's a joint venture bringing together the University of Melbourne and its Success for All initiative with the Rethinking Assessment movement in the UK. Rethinking Assessment is a collective of state and independent school and trust leaders, academics, politicians, employers, and heads of unions. We're united in our belief that the assessment system we have currently is broken, and in our determination to find a better way to evidence the knowledge, skills, and dispositions of all of our young people. We're thrilled to be joined by some 500 people for this event. This reflects the status and reputation of our keynote speakers, and I think it's an indication of how strongly educationalists around the world feel that now is the time to effect significant change in our system. I'd like to welcome all our international friends from a wide range of time zones. Bill Lucas is going to facilitate the discussion today. Bill is Professor of Learning at the University of Winchester and one of the co-founders of Rethinking Assessment. He'll invite our speakers to consider 5 key questions. And after that, he'll put some comments and questions from you, the audience, to our guests. So please do feel free to use the chat bar at any point for comments and the Q&A function for formal questions. So it's over to you, Bill.
Rachel, thank you very much. Those of you who can see the panel assembled will notice one very significant omission at the moment, that we're not yet joined by John Hattie, who is doubtless making his way through the Melbourne traffic, or at least that's what we hope. We have a backup plan. If for any reason he can only join us partway through, then Peter Hyman will stand in for him, and indeed I'll invite Peter to join us anyway, as John is not yet here. So the form, as Rachel has intimated, is to start in a moment with me just reiterating the 5 questions, and then I'll invite first Guy and then Peter to do a sort of initial throat clearing for about 3 minutes, just giving us their overall sense of this question that we're addressing. And then I'll turn to Guy and invite him to go a little deeper on his chosen aspects of this, and ditto to Peter, or indeed John, if he's joined us by then. And then we'll begin gradually to have a conversation and open it up to you. It's very exciting that across the world, there seems to be a genuine moment of reflection about the connectedness of assessment to pedagogy, curriculum, and the whole point of everything that we're doing in and around school. And the 5 questions that we're offering our panelists and you to consider today are: 1, what are the desirable dispositions we might want all young people to develop at school? 2, how might we evidence them? 3, what are the challenges? 4, what's helpful and what's not helpful with assessment in schools today? And 5, in a perfect world, what kind of assessment would young people emerge from secondary school with? It's my very great pleasure to invite my friend and colleague, Guy Claxton, to start off with his own inimitable throat clearing. Guy, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill and Rachel, and potentially Peter for turning into John, if John doesn't appear. So initial thoughts. It seems obvious to me that there are multiple desirable outcomes for education. No school that I've ever met or that I know of advertises itself proudly as a school that will squeeze grades out of your children by hook or by crook and do nothing else. There are occasionally schools that seem to function as if that was all they cared about, but there is always some rhetoric, at least in every school, about what else is valued. So I'm always thinking about what I call results plus. And I think what is exercising us today is what is the plus in addition to results. Note, not plus not something else in opposition to results or in tension with the results or in conflict with the results, but in addition to. And I don't see any disagreement about that. People disagree about what the plus is, and particularly as we're focusing on today, about how we are to evidence the development of these other valued outcomes, what the Singapore Ministry of Education call the desirable outcomes of education. If you look on their website, you won't see an awful lot. It's taken for granted that exam results are important, as indeed they are, but their desirable outcomes of education are many and various, and they're all fall roughly under the heading of what we're calling dispositions. So crucially, whatever forms of assessment we use in school must be supportive of all of those desirable outcomes. Let's just say, take very simply, let's say we have two clusters, one to do with knowledge acquisition and one to do with the development of personal dispositions, call them D1 and D2. There's no point in prioritizing a form of assessment for D1 that has a deleterious effect on the development of D2. Yet, that is to an extent what has been happening in education. We know that the tail of assessment wags the dog of teaching and learning. If all we're concerned about in practice is the acquisition of results, grades and test scores and so on, there are forms of teaching, some of them are called direct instruction or good old-fashioned chalk and talk, which might be pretty successful at helping young people get the test scores that they need to get. But there's a gathering amount of evidence which shows that there is a kind of toxic side effect of that kind of teaching, so that desirable dispositions like creativity and curiosity, for example, seem to be damaged by that kind of teaching. So my starting point is to make sure that whatever ideas we come up for are positive with respect to the full range of outcomes that we say we valued in education. That's my throat clearing bit.
Wonderful as ever. Thank you very much. And Peter, how would you start off your throat clearing on this?
Good. Well, first thing to say is I'm a very poor substitute, so apologies for John Hattie, who will hopefully still join us shortly. I'm co-director of Big Education, which is a group of schools and social enterprise, and also co-founder of School 21, a 4 to 18 school in Stratford in Newham. And since the beginning of that school that started in 2012, we wanted to change the currency away from just believing it's about exam results. And one of the most effective ways we've attempted to do that is by talking of beautiful work. And to say that the aim of both teachers and students whilst at school is to create beautiful work. And beautiful work in its widest sense. That could be a poem, it could be an artifact, it could be an essay, it could be a whole range of things. And we had one magical inset day or staff training day where every member of staff brought in a piece of beautiful work, either that they had created or that a member of their family had created. And it was very powerful to unpick, well, what is it that makes that work beautiful? What are the skills? What are the knowledge? What are the dispositions that go into that? And as soon as you've got teachers and students talking in that way, they're not just talking about what do they get in a test or what do they get in a grade, but they're thinking about what is the currency that, after all, is the currency in the world that they're going to go into, which is we're judged on the quality of our work and the impact that work has on the wider group of people it's trying to serve. And it seems to me that is a very good starting point. And out of that, we have developed what we call a curriculum of head, heart, and hand. And again, if you believe in that wider, more expansive curriculum, then very quickly you realize it's utterly absurd to only be assessing a narrow bit of the head, not even all the aspects of the head, and then to leave out totally giving any evidencing or credentialing or even recognition of the heart and the hand. So you need to then think, well, what matters in those areas? So the detail work that needs to go in to begin with is about the curriculum and the purpose of education, what you see the curriculum being. And that's what we spent a lot of time on. And then I think it is sometimes difficult, but we've all got to strive to say, well, how then do we measure all the things that we value? And I think to put things into different categories, and we've begun to do this in rethinking assessment, of saying, well, what are the things you just want to track? You may not want to give a number or a grade or something, but you just want to track, and well-being, which is obviously particularly relevant as young people return from lockdown. What is the state of their well-being? Well, you don't want to give someone a composite grade. You've been in education for 12 years. Here's one grade that marks your well-being. What you actually want to do is track it over a period of time, but also give snapshots so that a school or individual teachers can intervene. So that's one type of it. There's some other areas where you may want to just evidence it and get a student to create a portfolio of work and give and self-evident, self-assess how they've done in certain criteria. And then there's a third area where we might want to get into the game of saying, well, how do we actually assess this without killing it by over-assessing it, but give some kind of composite grade? And here we can learn a huge amount from what employers are already doing with what they call their strength-based assessments, where they often give a person they're trying to employ, having done a whole series of assessments, a sort of wheel where you've got various spikes of things that you're particularly good at. And it doesn't seem to me any reason why we can't create a sophisticated version of that, which every young person can leave school with, alongside their academic results as well. So that is a sort of direction of travel, I think, that could be really fruitful.
Thanks so much, Peter. That's really, really helpful. I'm going to pass back to Guy in a second, and just in addition to anything else that Guy's going to say, just pick up something from the chat, which is a direct response to something that Guy said already, which is the results plus metric. The question there is, does the plus get left to the periphery, or can you make sure that the plus is an equal plus? Just by way of just linking into what Guy might say, and also just to remind folk, please use the Q&A function, and any specific questions, pop them in there. Guy.
I'd just like to reinforce something that Peter said, which I think is very important, which is, first of all, we need to decide on the purpose of our assessment. There is no one form of assessment that is optimal for all the jobs that we might want it to do. So is the purpose of your assessment for convincing parents that you're doing a good job? Is it for giving feedback to students to support their development? Is it to monitor the effectiveness of your school development plan? Is it to satisfy some government bean counters or some external agency? Your optimal answer to any of those is going to be different, and they're going to be different. And this is where I want to reinforce what Peter was saying, in terms of just the vocabulary that we use. People often leap into using the words assess and measure. And we shouldn't be trapped by those words. There are a whole range. We need a broader vocabulary so that we give ourselves the linguistic freedom to choose the right method for the right purpose, rather than immediately saying measure, which automatically restricts us to quantitative forms of evaluation. So, and Peter used the word assess. He talked about tracking. You could talk about evidencing. You could talk about illustrating. You could talk about, there's a whole range of words that we could use. My favorite is evidencing. And for me, that's the most neutral word, which doesn't prejudge the kind of data that you're going to find useful for your particular purpose. I know, because I've spoken to John Hattie recently, that he's completely of the view that there's no point that you have to know what your purpose is before you can decide what the best form of assessment is. You have to know what use your evaluation is going to be to somebody, to some constituency, before you can decide what the best is going to be. So I would just counsel against automatically assuming that measure is necessary or even that measure is best. And as Peter said, the business world, which is as hard-headed a world as you can get, is extremely comfortable with judgments, with appraisals, with 360-degree appraisals, with forms of assessment, which are largely, if not wholly, qualitative rather than quantitative. Whereas in education, we seem to fall prey to the idea that unless it's got numbers attached to it, it's somehow risky or subjective or less valuable or less reliable or more open to bias or cheating or something if it doesn't have a number on it. And there are all kinds of good reasons as to why that kind of thinking is counterproductive as well as unjustifiable. But I think one thing we need to do is to not talk sort of broadly and blandly about what the plus is. The kinds of words that people use around the world are illustrative of the fact that everybody is concerned about this, but people are coming up again with different kinds of expressions: 21st century skills, non-cognitive skills, soft skills, character strengths, learning dispositions, habits of mind, what have you. They're all in the same territory. They're all attempt to try to get to grips with what the plus is, what we think youngsters need, what they're entitled to from education. But then beyond that, we have to, when we get into the world of, let's use the word dispositions, which is the word that's used in the title for this conversation, we have to be thinking broadly, as our question today says, broadly and coherently and comprehensively about what are the dispositions or the habits of mind that we think the majority of young people are likely to benefit from having, and therefore are likely to benefit from having had developed or strengthened through their schooling. And everybody has a list. Most people's lists overlap. My view is they overlap by about 80 or 90%. And there's always room for disagreement, of course, but we can't decide on what our assessment methodologies should be until we've decided what it is that we're after. So these are some of the things at the top of my list, for example, that I would need to say. So I've already mentioned curiosity. We know curiosity is the most powerful driver of learning. To have a sense of being investigative, being adventurous, wondering about things. And yet, you know, we've often neglected that in education, and neglected it or even damaged it in terms of our approach to assessment. Number two, rational skepticism. The ability and the disposition, the inclination to question the knowledge claims that come your way. Absolutely vital. And this is now across, for example, in Finland, across the whole system in Finland, in primary schools. Children walk into any Finnish primary school and children will be able to tell you the difference between disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. And they are daily becoming more skilled and more practiced at approaching the information that they find, the claims that are made through advertisements or the fake news of politicians or people claiming to be this, that, and the other on the internet. Absolutely vital, not just skill. There's a skilled element to it, obviously, but there's necessarily a dispositional element. I would want, if I had a 12-year-old daughter, I would want her to be dispositionally skeptical about who she was interacting with online. I'd want her antennae to be quivering about whether the person that she's talking to but can't see really is the kind of person that they claim to be. So thirdly, the control of attention. There's a big interest in mindfulness in schools, and mindfulness is a set of practices for gaining greater control over your attention in a world where the attention economy is trying to grab your attention. You need to be able to pay attention to those things which matter most to you at the moment. Intellectual humility, a lot of interest in the academic literature about that kind of willingness to hold your knowledge tentatively. Again, not something which schools have been particularly good at. Imagination, exploratory thinking, thinking your way towards something that is not prejudged is pretty critical. Whereas often in the big wide world, we come across thinking which is just self-justificatory or defensive. People have decided what they believe is true or what they want to be true, and then their cognitive resources are dedicated to the promotion of a point of view. And often that becomes very belligerent. It becomes aggressive as well as defensive. And you see that a lot in the political arena at the moment. It becomes about winning the argument to justify the opinions that you've already had. Determination and what Bill's called tenacity, grit, perseverance, growth mindset, obviously, although we mustn't be trapped into thinking that that cluster of things are the only things that we mean when we talk about dispositions. So they will be a few things to start with. And once we've begun to adumbrate those things, only then, I think, can we begin to ask serious questions about what would be the best ways of evidencing their development.
And Guy, if those are hypothetically the sort of dispositional curriculum, I know they don't quite function like that. There were sort of 7 or 8 of those. How big should they be? You've deliberately been quite granular in saying things like curiosity as opposed to perhaps creativity or learning, control of attention as a feature of either mindfulness or metacognition, imagination as a feature of, it could be put in a number of different areas. Could you just talk us through the kind of the extent of the kind of thing that we're looking at in your view?
It's a very good question, Bill. I think getting the grain right is very important, certainly for the development of pedagogies. And I haven't thought this through as clearly, but I'm sure for the development of evidencing techniques or routines as well. It's like I didn't put creativity in my list because I think words like creativity or motivation are too big to get a handle on. I think you need to turn up the power on your microscope a little bit and go to a somewhat more detailed level of concern. But if you go too detailed, then you end up with more than people can grasp in their minds. Although I know the school that Rachel used to run had proudly a wheel of 52 dispositions, which Rachel and I used to argue about. I said they were too many to be able to function with, and her school, Isaac Newton Academy, has proved me wrong about that. But I think it's a good question. So we need to drill down, and particularly as we become more forensic about this aspect of education, this habits of mind building, so we can involve students in the discovery of what lies behind each of these sort of headline labels, so to speak. So collaborativeness, for example, is a very important aspect. It wasn't on my list, but it should have been there. The ability to be a good discussant, a good sounding board, what have you. And I'm mindful of a school that I've worked with, St. Bernard's Catholic Primary School on the Wirral, where the kids were, as it were, dissecting the notion of collaboration into umpteen different elements, not jumping in, not hogging the discussion, building on what other people have said, and so on. These are 8, 9, 10-year-old children who are becoming more mindful about the complexity of each of these concepts. And I think that's a very good thing. So they're not only growing in the strength of these dispositions, but they're growing in their ability to understand the complexity and the sophistication, to become more precise, more fine-tuned, more forensic in their approach. And therefore, we need to be finding forms of assessment which drive those kinds of reflective conversations.
Thanks, Guy. Peter, especially the conversation that Guy was initiating about the degree of granularity in terms of any disposition one might focus on. What's your view there?
Yes, I mean, I love always the language that Guy uses, because they're often more interesting ways of putting things. And I like the level it's pitched at, that I buy that sometimes, I mean, creativity, I think, is still a useful concept, but as you say, it's a group of dispositions. I also agree with the idea that there appears to be hundreds of these floating around the world, but actually they do coalesce. Most people are in roughly the same territory. So they're sometimes called the 4 C's or whatever. So the idea that there's stuff around critical thinking, stuff around creativity, although, you know, I like the way guys call that curiosity, or broken it down into curiosity and imagination. There's stuff around collaboration. There's stuff around communication. We've obviously done a lot of work through Voice 21 and other things on oracy, which we see as a bit of a golden thread between head, heart and hand, that you need it for all 3. So there's obviously stuff around communication. I think the sort of what of these is really important, but we shouldn't make such heavy weather of it that we can't then coalesce around the right things. And then I think the how becomes very interesting, because there's a very rich debate. Some of it's already being played out on the chat here. And I'd love your view on this, Guy, as to whether some people, particularly those who are very much in this sort of knowledge rich curriculum camp, say, look, you can't do any of these things divorced of the subject. So, you know, creativity only is effective if it's creativity in maths. Similarly, critical thinking in history, and divorced from that, it is meaningless. My common sense test on this tells me, in the way I and others operate in life, tells me that's not true. It's not that you shouldn't be doing those in individual subjects. It's that they go well beyond that. And some of those skills do become transferable and do become ways of looking at the world. I think people are disposed to be curious in whatever they're looking at in the world, not just the individual subjects they're operating in. But I'd love your view, because that's quite a common position at the moment. These things are completely pointless unless they're rooted to an individual subject.
Guy.
Bill, can I respond?
Yes, please do.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there is a kind of superficial sense in which you could argue that there's no such things as generic skills that can be taught in complete abstract, although Daniel Willingham, who's one of the go-to cognitive sources of truth on cognitive psychology and the nature of the mind, has recently recanted his opposition to the idea of generic skills, particularly in the context of critical thinking. There is plenty of research that shows that there are relatively content-free, not completely, but relatively content-free skills or forms of questioning or critical analysis, which can be applied pretty broadly to things that you read on the news, things that you come across online, in a broad range, very, very broad range of different topics and concepts. So, there is a little bit of sense in questioning the idea of generic skills, but I think what's important is the idea that in teaching, there are certain forms of teaching. David Perkins, one of my gurus, is very good on this. There are certain forms of teaching that are good at helping skills or dispositions become more disembedded. So they start by being embedded in science or in history. Let's say the disposition of critical questioning of knowledge claims and texts. Yes, they're somewhat different in science and history, but yes, the two circles of the Venn diagram overlap, as Peter said, quite considerably. And I've worked with schools that have had students in secondary schools that have had students analyzing in significant detail how critical thinking is similar to and different from in history and in science. And that's a very good intellectual exercise. So I think when I'm getting closer to thinking about how we can evidence the development of these dispositions, I tend to think of breaking that down into three strands, if you like. So dispositions develop in three different dimensions or three different senses. One is they're becoming stronger or more robust, less dependent upon an auspicious or supportive environment. Secondly, they're becoming broader. That is to say, as Peter was saying, they manifest in an increasing number of different domains or spheres of life. And thirdly, they're becoming deeper or richer or more sophisticated. In other words, more skillful, more variegated. So you could say that, Ruby she's becoming a better questioner. Her disposition to question is growing. She used to only ask questions when the teacher was being very supportive, but now she's becoming much more robust. She used to only ask questions in English, but now she's asking questions in maths and in her hockey training as well. And she used to ask questions that were relatively blunt, but now her questions are much more refined and precise in terms of eliciting exactly the information that she wants. And I find that tripartite view of dispositions helpful to me when I start to think about how we evidence progress. So you could, for example, look at, if you're taking a subject-wide, a curriculum-wide view of youngsters, pose yourself the question, how are we going to see whether Ruby's questioning is transferring from maths to science to geography to history to business studies to the hockey field? And it will be perfectly plausible to gather evidence about that.
Wonderful.
Likewise about the increasing robustness and about the increasing sophistication. So I find that three-pronged approach helpful in getting me to the point where I can begin to think about what would be practical methods of evidencing.
Great. We're going to move into both practice and policy shift in a second. You mentioned two names there, David Perkins, who has that lovely phrase, sensitivity to occasion, to describe one's growing confidence and capability in recognizing those little kind of trigger moments when you might deploy habit X or disposition Y. And I read something from Daniel Willingham recently where he's also recanting in terms of grit, and is beginning to talk very favorably about some, but not all, of the scales out there. This is Angela Duckworth, that are increasingly well evidenced. And I'm going to shift to Peter, if I might, and just say, Peter, with your school and academy trust head on, how do you organize this? How do you construct this at the very practical school level? In a secondary school, who takes responsibility for tracking dispositions if you're historically referred to as a teacher of science or a teacher of something else?
Well, I think the simple answer is everyone's got to do it. And I think that's probably what we're saying, that it has to be in every subject. And I've always liked the idea, which I think you and Guy talked about ages ago, about the sort of split screen teaching. And this actually backs up the idea of sort of embedding them to start with, these dispositions within a subject, that you are, what you learn as a teacher very quickly is what you talk about and what you ask for feedback on from students is what then they think matters. I mean, it's true in life generally. So if you're saying to them, we find this with oracy the whole time, if a group has been doing a task looking at a particular subject, but using various oracy protocols, and when they feed back to the teacher, you're asking them immediately for feedback, not just on the subject matter, but on how good the quality of oracy was, then again, young people know that you care about that and you want them to get better. And then they unpick, well, this bit of our talk was fruitful and we really explored it, but we got stuck on this, so that then we'll go back and look at the oracy technique. Now, you can do that with any disposition. So I think it's embedding it I think a lot of these things start in the classroom. Then you can do some clever things through the form tutor, we call them the coach, where you're trying to work systematically. And I always think priming some of these things in discrete lessons, where you're actually making people aware of the language that we're using and the way we then look at it across the school, gets them being more intentional themselves as students about how they can connect things up within the curriculum. So like most things in school, if you want them to really stick, I think they're multi-layered.
Okay.
And they're modeled from the top down as a way of approaching. And look, the work that you and others have done on, look, it seems to me the more we talk about this 100-year life that young people born today are going to live, God willing, for 100 years, the more you've got to think about school being about powerful learners, and that that is what you're trying to develop, those with that real skill in all the different ways, as guys have said, stronger, broader, more sophisticated, that they become year after year at being powerful learners. And it's that they will take through the rest of their lives.
Peter, can you put your policy hat on now? We've got a question from Harry Locke that says, I'm going to put it slightly into my words. Come on, we've been here before. We've had innovative approaches to this beforehand. We even had a national record of achievement. We've had people talking about strength-based assessment for quite a while now. Who holds the power here, and how on earth are we going to get change here?
Well, I think in the UK and obviously in lots of other countries as well, I think the suspension of traditional exams for 2 years has given a real opening. So a lot more people than before are rethinking assessment. So I think the climate is good because of that. I think 2 or 3 other things are coming together. I think the first is that the old game and the old story that somehow if you kept your head down, you just passed your exams, you got to university, you got a degree, you popped out the other end, everything would be well. That game is now beginning to break down, and in different sectors and in different countries at varying speeds, but with more and more employers saying that is not a good proxy anymore for the sort of skills and dispositions we want. I think at that point, that has got to start feeding back into schools and saying, if all we're doing is getting them through exams and they haven't got all these other skills that they need, not just for employment, but for life more generally, then we've got to rethink what the balance is. And the more employers who are becoming qualifications blind will send that powerful signal that we've got to change the game that we're playing. So I think that's happening. I think there's a lot of other strands to do with young people's mental health, which has been exacerbated during lockdown, and the idea of doing for GCSEs, obviously in the UK, you've got 30 to 40 exams in 1 month, age 16, that most people think is potty. But you've got, a lot of other strands to do with mental health, to do with the forgotten third and and how it's not supporting young people, a lot of young people. So I think there's a growing set of arguments, exacerbated and added to by COVID, that makes this different than what has gone before, even though we need to learn, as the person asking the question said, we don't want to just sort of go round the same loops again. We've got to learn from some of the failures of the past to make change. But I do think we're in better circumstances now than we've ever been.
Thanks. Guy, a question from Dave Gibbs about the mutability and learnability of dispositions. And I think a worry that we might be accidentally deciding on some almost trait-like dispositions, which school couldn't really do much for or with. Is that something you could just give us your reflections on?
I mean, it's always an open question as to, which of these, to what extent are these dispositions malleable? It's an empirical question. My reading of the research says that very few of these dispositions are, so to speak, dyed in the wool or genetically predetermined. In the era of epigenetics, we know that all of our personality traits, dispositions, characteristics, strengths, call them whatever you like, arise as a mixture of our genetic endowment and the environments in which we find ourselves. the environments in which we find ourselves are unquestionably formative of our characters and our personalities. First, our school, our families, our schools, our friendship groups, and so on. We are malleable beings. We all turn out. Any of you who've had more than one child will have been amazed at how different they become, even in the same family environment. And that can't be a matter of genetics. That has to be a matter of the particular kind of psychological niches that people create for themselves and what is drawn out of them in those niches. So I think for me, the evidence is very strong that, for example, curiosity can go up and down. Curiosity can be beaten out of people, or curiosity can be invited and welcomed and strengthened. I think critical thinking, obviously, is something that you wouldn't expect a babe in arms to be good at, but is certainly something that by the time children are starting school, we know very well that they can begin to build up skills, strategies, and attitudes which lead them in the direction of building the capacity for what I call onboard safeguarding, being able to make yourself safe in a world of dangerous and manipulative knowledge claims. We know that some kids are better than others. We know from the Finnish example that these things are coachable, trainable, cultivatable. So I think it's more scientifically valid and more educationally productive to be erring on the side of how malleable these things might be, so that we can then go looking for possible ways of helping them to develop, rather than to assume that they're not, and therefore put no energy into thinking about how we might help these things to grow.
Guy, sorry, Rachel.
I was just going to say there's an extra bit which I think is really interesting to Dave's question about inequalities, and at Rethinking Assessment we're very conscious of the forgotten third and the fact that the exam system doubly disadvantages the already disadvantaged. Dave's question is asking about dispositions and whether we believe, or your evidence would show, that there are inbuilt advantages for some pupils and some learners in terms of early development of dispositions, and how we, through measuring or evidencing dispositions, ensure that we don't perpetuate the current inequalities.
Was that a question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, of course, that's very important, but I don't see it as being a big problem. I mean, you can start to, I mean, if in the ideal world there was a much greater parity of esteem, I'm talking edge language now, between the traditional high status academic subjects of maths and science and the more practical, embodied, physical subjects of dance and drama, the things that Ken Robinson used to carry such a banner for, any one of those can be a fertile breeding ground for the development of whatever dispositions you might like. There's critical thinking in carpentry galore. There's creative thinking in dance, obviously, but there's also collaboration, there's also reflection, there's also the whole range of things. So I see no a priori reason why the desire to build disposition in young people should be taken as giving an extra advantage to those who might already have a head start in some of those dispositions. I just don't see why we should make that assumption.
Thanks, Guy. There are a clutch of questions about the role of students in this process from Kate and from Malcolm, and a recent question from William Applebaum, where he says in a very nice sort of way, come on, folks, how are we going to do this? We've had a good run around in terms of what dispositions and some of the policy and practical issues. What are the methods that we might like to use better to evidence the kind of things that we all seem to be in broad agreement on. And I'm going to invite perhaps Rachel to take on the chairing role, and I can then contribute to that conversation, but come back to invite Peter to start off where his mind goes here. What methods might we be using?
Well, in all our deliberations on the rethinking assessment working groups that are sort of beavering away on this at the moment, the word that keeps, I don't know whether it's a nice word or not, but keeps popping up is multimodal. And we know that, you know, the survey of how schools have done across the world during lockdown and suspension of exams, which may be blindingly obvious because those that haven't put all their eggs in the terminal exam basket have fared much better. But more generally, people have realized there's a whole number of ways of evidencing. And when, Rachel, you yourself wrote a blog recently about medical degrees, using Exeter as an example, where there were 17, well, there were more than 10, and there was actually an engineering degree where they've got 17 modes of assessment. Now, if engineering degrees, medical degrees, high status professions are using, and obviously a degree is, you know, a high form of academic achievement, are using huge variety from observing people in action to forms of oral presentation, to other chairing seminars and how well you're doing at that, from the more traditional exam-based. You know, if those have got credibility at university level, again, those who say, well, we can't do anything better at secondary school level seem to be being defeatist, because we can try, and we are already clearly in certain exams, whether it's languages, all parts of languages, or whether it's some of the creative subjects, where already that's done based on extended pieces of work with teacher assessment. There are examples already in the system, and we ought to be able to extrapolate them. So I don't believe this is beyond us, but there's some tricky things to navigate.
And just on universities and comparisons between the way in which we assess or evidence progress and strengths and learning in schools versus perhaps the more broad and expansive way at university. There was a question early on from Ewan around a perception that university admissions officers or tutors are perhaps very narrow in their thinking in some institutions and not welcoming of, for example, mastery transcripts or more holistic measures of evidence. Where do you think we are with that? And his question is, who needs to make the first move? Is it the school leaders or is it the university admissions tutors? Throw that open to anybody who'd like to take it. Bill, do you want to come in on that one? I
was struck by something that Guy wrote in a recent blog, where he elegantly lobbed this role at on the laps of employers rather than at the kind of exit point from schools. And I found myself very intrigued by that. And just sort of pulling back from that, I think there's such a rich palette of possible assessment or evidencing methods that we could use. That, I mean, just for example, in the rethinking assessment work that we've been doing recently, there are really good and well-validated psychometrics. There are useful self-report inventories out there. There's a battery of different kinds of performance-based assessment. Don't forget, the Viva at the end of a PhD is a rather good example of a performance-based assessment, as is a music exam taken on demand when you're ready for it, as is a driving test, presumably, which you don't want to crash too much before you enter it. And there's going to be a dialogue between you and your teacher, your driving instructor. The Victorian Curriculum Assessment Authority has a nice set of online performance-based assessments that they use for critical and creative thinking. And we've got lots of friends from Australia on this call. There's a whole number of what are increasingly terming themselves mastery transcript initiatives, mainly but not exclusively in the United States and Canada. In a conversation I was having with John Hattie out of this call, he was telling me about the growth of micro-credentialing, what's sometimes referred to as digital badges, and how in the early days when he tried this in New Zealand, this hadn't been a great success, but gradually had become more and more robust once you realized it wasn't a straight, I totally have it, but there were some degrees of gradation as you achieved, as it were, mastery. I haven't got a better, less gendered word there. I think there's some learning to be had from the gaming and simulation industry. And I think it's all, and even comparative judgment. I'm quite interested in that, which is working interestingly on the written text, whether that could be used orally or in recordings of, or even group work, perhaps. And I think all of this, the future is visual and the future is digital, as opposed to bonkers and numeric. And I think that we're going to want a much richer picture of this. And I think there's an open question as to what role the student plays in all of that.
So Guy, do you have a favourite, and is it one that involves both teacher feedback and learner feedback and maybe even parental feedback? Is it a system that can be implemented anywhere for children who don't have education in school or for older learners?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we've been talking. I'm back to my idea that you need to specify your purpose before you can specify. So we've been talking about university entrance. We've been talking about summative kinds of assessment, but I think very importantly, we need to keep our minds open to a whole range of different ways of just pedagogical shifts that bring day-to-day micro assessments or micro evaluations of dispositions into the classroom. One of my favorite examples was of a teacher shared this one with me. He would have like once a term or twice a term, make time to have a conversation, as I know you did in Isaac Newton Academy, to like review with a student, a teacher and a student, or it could be an older student and a younger student, reviewing, let's say, the younger student's progress. And this particular example I rather liked. So I'm sitting with Anna and I'm saying, Anna, tell me about your resilience, your grit, your tenacity. And she gives me some examples of, how, well, like she's becoming more tenacious or showing more grit in somewhere or other. And then I say to her, okay, that's really interesting as a snapshot of where you are now. Let's, just for the sake of argument, let's call that 4 on some kind of scale. Could we now begin to have a conversation about what 5 might look like to you? Now, the number doesn't matter at all. What's the point is you're involving the student themselves in a developmental conversation about what would count for them as being an achievable personal best in developing their resilience. Yes, I think I might need to take it into my swimming lessons more, and this is how I could push myself to be more resilient in my swimming training or whatever it might be. So I think we're looking at a whole gamut, like the world is generating a whole lot of interesting things at different scales for different purposes at different levels, all the way from a little conversational formative a judgment assessment like that, which is explicitly designed to further growth of the student, way up to, all singing, all dancing, multi-level matrices, which some countries I know have put a lot of energy into, in order to say, we've identified 12 different levels of 12 different dispositions, and we can map them all, and we can turn this description into a 6 and this description into a 7. I'm not a great fan of those kinds of things myself, but I just think it's a time for largely school-based creativity and innovation around this question. And I think we are tinkering our way fast forward about how to do this better.
Great, thank you. Back to you, Bill.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Now, in the planned, perfectly well organised, entirely illusory world of an online discussion like this, I was going to turn at this stage to both Guy and John and say, so, okay, in a perfect world, what would all this look like? And I'm going to do that in a minute. And I'm just going to give you some thinking time. I'm going to invite all of us just to close with about 30 seconds of the first few thoughts of what it might look like in a perfect world. And then if you go last, Rachel, then when you've had enough of us, you could bring the whole thing to a close. And I'm going to invite Peter to start and then Rachel to take over and do it in whatever order she thinks most appropriate.
Right, I think in a few years' time, you will end up with everyone leaving school with a URL link. So they've basically got a website which has the story of who they are as a learner. It has some of their best work. It has links to videos and vivas of themselves. It has links to any exams they might have taken, but it's basically a record of who they are and a curated story of their learning. And on the grounds that the vast majority of jobs that people will do, no one's ever going to in the future ask for their grades. They're going to ask, as we do today, what's the quality of your work? Show us your work. You don't ask someone who's developing your website what GCSE and IT they got. You say, well, show us the other websites you've created. And I think that will be the spirit. And I think it feeds on from what Bill said about exit versus entry. The heretical view is to say you don't need any exit exams from school at all. You've got your story of learning, you've got your work, and then where you go to next can decide they want to top up whatever you show them from this website with some other entry requirements, and then that's up to them for the next part of your journey. But that would be one very radical way of thinking about where this might end up in a few years' time.
Thank you, Peter. Guy?
Yes, that very similar ideas. I think the potential for the kinds of e-portfolios, the development of, what was it? There was a very nice blog that Rethinking Assessment put out, or re-blogged from Tom van der Ark a little while ago, which just put a lot of flesh on these particular bones. The wrinkle that I particularly liked, I don't remember the school, it was somewhere in the north of England, where the students were already doing this, were already developing an e-portfolio. But the wrinkle I liked was that at their exit point from school, they had a detailed interview with a member of the community, not with a member of the school staff, about their portfolio. They were interrogated about it. They were asked to expound on, and so on. And it could be that the student had some say in who that person might be, so that it really was someone who the student had respect for. And it was a serious conversation and quite probing, at the end of which some kind of real or virtual imprimatur was given to that portfolio by this person with status, external status in the world and status in the eyes of the student. It was given like a sort of stamp of approval. And in that school, and I can imagine in any other school that tried to do that, that would carry a lot of weight with the students and with whoever might want to employ or educate that person further.
I love that idea, and that ties in with, for example, the analogy that I had in my blog around medicine school, where junior doctors and those kind of in their final years of a medicine degree have assessments by GPs and by ward doctors and consultants. It sort of brings that external, objective but expert perspective in. Thanks, Guy.
Yeah.
Bill?
I'm afraid I rather wearisomely agree with Guy and Peter, so I'll take a slightly different tack. And that is, I'd like to imagine a world in which Guy's results plus argument will have been won. It'll have been won so comprehensively that we don't have to have these ridiculous binary discussions about whether we want young people who can be kind and think for themselves and also brilliant in other more conventional academic, so-called academic senses. I think the one shift I can see coming, and this is sort of in honor of John Hattie, who's sadly not with us today. But the same revolution that he brought about with visible learning, I think needs to happen with assessment. So I'm thinking of visible assessment, where we use the abstract or the least freighted word evidence and evidencing, and we then have a conversation to discuss and to divine what the purpose of this activity is. And then we draw from a well-evidenced bank of possible methods. And then we apply Peter's stricture, do we need to just make a note of this? Is it a little bit more formal? Is it something we're more interested in progression about? And I think that's a world of greater teacher assessment, confidence and literacy.
Thanks, Bill. And for those of you, I'm sure there aren't many, but for anyone who might be thinking that all sounds very utopian, in a way, it takes us back to a question that was posted very early and we didn't have time for, but it was from Julie, and it was around comparisons with the early years curriculum and the way in which we evidence learning and progress, both in terms of hard knowledge and in terms of skills and disposition development. And it's happening every day up and down the country for 4 and 5 year olds. So there's absolutely no reason why we can't learn from all that wonderful, great practice as we go further up the primary years and the secondary, I would argue. Okay, I'm going to bring us to a close, and first of all say that this wasn't the debate and discussion that I was sort of envisaging and expected I was going to have, and I shan't be saying a thank you quite in the same way that I was going to. But I think what our panelists today have done is shown amazing dispositions of flexibility and adaptability and quick thinkingness. So top marks for your dispositions coming out there, naturally, habitually, deep and strongly. And it's been a really rich and inspiring discussion. I hope that everybody who's been on the call has been as energized by the debate as I felt. And that if you haven't already discovered Rethinking Assessment, that you take some time to visit our website, where you'll find lots of blogs, links to promising practices across the world, and further details of how you can get involved in this movement, which we think is so important. I'd like to say, Guy, a huge thank you to you for sharing your wisdom with us, speaking with such eloquence and fluidity as you always do. But I know that you will forgive me for giving a special big thank you today to Peter Hyman for stepping in at literally 1 minute's notice to be an admirable replacement for John Hattie, and to hear about what you're doing in Big Education and at School 21 has been fascinating, Peter. Thank you. Big thank you to Bill for comparing and chairing, and to wish everybody a very happy rest of the week and a great Easter break when you get to it. Thanks very much, everybody.